As far as video game villains go, Bowser is easily one of the most recognizable ones out there, as well as one of the most persistent. For over 35 years, the Koopa King has plagued Mario and his friends in an attempt to kidnap Princess Peach and take over the Mushroom Kingdom once and for all. But every king needs a kingdom, as well as an army of loyal subjects willing to do their bidding. That begs the question, which of these Bowser baddies are the elite of the elite, and which ones are about as weak as an actual real-life turtle? I'm Keefinosi with 1UP Binge, and this is Bowser's Troops. Weak to powerful. Before we get into our ranking, we have to set up a few ground rules. First, it should be noted that not every enemy Mario faces works for Bowser, so we're only going to be counting enemies that are confirmed to be part of the Koopa Troop at one point or another. Additionally, we won't consider any boss characters nor even individual characters of the same species, since that would make for an extended and unbalanced list. That being said, if you'd like us to cover those in another video, let us know in the comments below. Furthermore, we will not be counting any subspecies of enemies in this list. If we did, this list would be several times longer than it already is. If a particular species has any notable subspecies that make them significantly stronger or weaker, that will affect the ranking of the overall species. With all of that out of the way, let's get into our rankings. As usual, we will be starting with the weakest enemies and working our way to the strongest mobs in the Mario world, who are working for Bowser. Our pick for the weakest baddie has to go to the Goonies. The Goonies are a group of kids from Astoria, Oregon. They discover the treasure map of One-Eyed Willy where they... whoops, wrong script, hold on. There we go. Goonies are a species of bird-like enemies who mainly appear in the Yoshi games. There, they mostly fly lazily in the sky or wander around aimlessly in their flightless forms. The thing is, more often than not, these birds aren't really a threat, if you could even call them that ever. Their attack patterns are fairly slow and easy to avoid. Even their skeletal counterparts, which can drop bombs, are predictable enough to be avoided easily. Heck, more often than not, the Yoshis need them around to progress, as they can easily just ride the Goonies around like moving platforms to reach higher areas in the level. Because of that, we had to give the Goonie the gold medal of the weakest enemy. The silver medal of weakness goes to one of the newer enemies on the list, the Biddiebuds. These ladybug lookalikes are really only good at two things: walking and jamming out. That's pretty much the beginning and end of their contributions to the Koopa Troop. They spend their time constantly walking a set pattern over and over until they are inevitably stepped on or just ignored entirely. Aside from that, the only thing they do is buzz to the music's beat, which adds ambiance, if not effectiveness. Even their para forms merely hover above the ground, performing much the same function as their land-dwelling counterparts. Overall, these ineffective insects don't really add a whole lot of force to Bowser's forces. Our bronze medalist here takes us back to the skies of Yoshi's Island with the Gusties. Like with the Goonies, Gusties are airborne enemies that often appear in large numbers. They provide a source for infinite eggs and platforms for the Yoshis to reach higher areas and bridge large gaps. What sets them apart from their feathered friends is that these soaring spirits are much faster. This makes it more likely that the Yoshis might slip up and get hit, or possibly miss the timing of their jump. Still, they're not the most effective ghouls out there, and their contributions are often more of a hindrance than a help to Baby Bowser's cause, so we can't place them any higher than this. Just missing out on the bottom three, we finally reach the Goombas. They are often touted as the weakest members of Bowser's army, synonymous with cannon fodder. However, we couldn't actually place them at the bottom of this list in good faith for two main reasons. The first is that they actively chase after Mario and Co. in recent games, which places them above the Biddybubs by default. And the other, more substantial reason why they rank higher is the sheer number of variants they have. With over 50 distinct variants, Goombas almost have the highest number of subspecies of any other creature in the Mushroom Kingdom. This is proof that they have a high level of resilience and adaptability. Additionally, some of these variants, such as Hyper Goombas and Goom Beetles, can prove to be significant threats in and of themselves, which pushes the group's average up quite a bit. However, at the end of the day, they are still Goombas. The majority of the variants are just as weak as the original, so placing them any higher than this would just be dishonest. In a similar vein, we find Shy Guys in our next spot. Remember how we said that Goombas almost have the highest number of variants? Turns out they pale in comparison to the Shy Guys. With 87 variations, no other baddie comes close to the Shy Guys in terms of subspecies. However, this is mainly due to those wielding different weapons being classified as separate subspecies. The only notably distinct variants are the expressive kleptomaniacal bandits, the winged pitchfork-wielding Bezos, and the explosive cannon-faced Sniffets. While some of these variations can be severe threats, what hurts their average the most is their lack of presence in the main series. Outside of Super Mario Bros. 2 and a cameo in Super Mario Maker, their only appearances have been in spin-off titles. In those, they effectively take the place of Goombas in being low-level cannon fodder enemies that can be dispatched fairly easily. They don't pose much of a threat to Mario's group. Our next entrant might confuse some people, but we're placing the Octoombas here. While the name might suggest that these blue, blobulous baddies are a variant of the Goombas, they're actually a distinct species. They have their own subspecies separate of their mushroomy friends. Among these are the rock-spitting elite Octoombas, the evasive Octo Guys, and the gargantuan Octopi. While these variants can be more challenging than the average enemy, the base form stays true to its namesake in being weak overall. Even the stronger variants can be dispatched fairly easily with a little caution, earning them a spot among the other fodder enemies. No shade to the plant gang, but we're placing piranha plants next on our list. While they can be tricky to deal with at times, and they do have a fair number of variants to their name, the root of the problem with piranha plants is, well, their roots. More often than not, they are stuck to a single point in the level, only being able to pop in and out of pipes at most. This makes them fairly predictable and easy to avoid if they can't be just defeated altogether. Again, a few variants break this formula and they can be more formidable in some spin-off games, however we feel that this isn't enough to boost their average any higher than this. Next up we have the army's namesake, the Koopa Troopas. These tenacious turtles make up a bulk of the Koopa Troop, as their name implies, with many subspecies under their belts to help boost their average quite a bit. In fact, one could argue that a lot of the more elite members of the army are merely Koopa Troopas who have taken up arms in one way or another, but we'll get to those later. Much like the Goonies, Koopas have a reputation for being beneficial to Mario. Their shells can be used as both weapons and as puzzle-solving tools. However, that can hardly be counted against them, as this results from them being defeated rather than being used directly like the birds. Still, this does bring to light that they are easily defeated, which earns them a spot on the lower end of the list. In a surprisingly low ranking, our next spot has to go to the Thwomps. Yes, the Thwomps are nearly invincible in most games they appear in. In some cases, they're capable of causing instant death to Mario and his friends if they manage to crush them. However, that still comes down to a resounding if. As for all their strength and invulnerability, they can't really utilize that power very effectively. All they're really capable of is dropping straight down using their sheer weight to attack, which can be effective in some situations. However, that same weight proves to be a double-edged sword, as they require a fair amount of time and effort to reset themselves to try again. That limited range and slow recharge make them some of the most predictable and easily avoided enemies in the entire Mushroom Kingdom. Now, Thwomps have a few variations which address some of these issues. Still, even in these cases, their predictability is high enough that they can be considered more as obstacles rather than enemies. Heck, in some cases, they even function as platforms, or even kill other enemies that would otherwise be unable to be defeated. This places them in the same tier as the Goonies in terms of counterintuitiveness to the Koopa Troop's goals, solidifying the Thwomps a spot this low despite their immense power. Our next spot goes to another newer low-level enemy, the Sting Bees. These bee-like baddies may not be nearly as strong as our previous entrant, but they make up for it in their sheer tenacity. When Sting Bees spot Mario and his friends, they will relentlessly pursue them in an attempt to, as the name implies, sting them with their face stinger. This isn't the most effective strategy, as they are quite slow and can be defeated by any attack. However, it's still more effective than the other entrants we've covered, so we do have to give them some credit, even though we can't place them any higher. Next up is another recent addition to the Koopa Troop, the Huckit Crabs. Being the first entrant on our list to utilize a projectile attack by default, Hucket crabs naturally have an edge on our previous entrants. Nevertheless, the simplicity and ineffectiveness of their strategy prevent them from placing any higher. They simply stay in one spot, grab a rock or clump of sand, and, well, you guessed it, huck it at Mario. Again, it's the most effective strategy thus far on the list. However, it's still a predictable and easily avoided attack pattern. That, plus the fact that they are stationary targets that can be taken out by just about anything, places them this low on the list. Sticking with the beach theme, our next spot goes to the Cheep Cheeps. A staple enemy for levels in or near the water, these fishy fiends can be a bit tricky to deal with. When underwater, they have the advantage of being unable to be jumped on since, well, you can't jump underwater. However, all they can do is slowly swim around, meaning they're only a real threat when in a large swarm, or school in this case. Counterintuitively, however, it's out of the water where this fish is the most threatening. They leap out of the water, randomly, attempting to ram into Mario from underneath, which can be lethal in a swarm. And all of this isn't even considering the Cheep Cheep variants, including the boss basses, which can, deal instant death by simply swallowing Mario and friends. At the end of the day, however, they are just fish with little in the way of offense or defense, meaning we can't place them any higher than this. Our next entrant goes to another group of turtles, that being the Buzzy Beetles. The beetles are very similar to the Koopas. They can be stomped on and kicked around and used as weapons, which really harms their standing quite a bit. However, they do have a few things going for them that keep them from dropping any lower. For one thing, they're immune to fire and explosions, rendering them much more resilient than the Koopas, since they can basically only be defeated by getting stomped on. But this limited weakness only shines light on the subspecies. In particular, the Spike Top cannot be jumped on, making it one of the most durable single enemies in the entire series. That being said, not even the Spike Top can do much, as none of the Buzzy Beetles are capable of much beside walking slowly and crawling along walls. This means they can be easily avoided if they can't just, be defeated. Next up is another interesting enemy, the bullies. These metallic menaces look intimidating, but it turns out that they're not really that tough. They are incapable of directly dealing damage to Mario, only pushing him around and trying to knock him off of platforms. The danger here is that said platforms are almost always in dangerous areas, be they over lava, icy water, or even good old bottomless pits. While this whole no damage thing would be grounds for a lower ranking, what keeps them from placing any lower is that they can't be harmed. The only way the bullies can be defeated is for them to get bullied right back, knocking them off of the platforms first before they can do the same to you. As poetic as that is, it's still a trickier method than simply stomping on their heads and being done with them. This earns them a slightly higher ranking than they would have gotten otherwise. Our next spot has to go to the Skeeters. Like a lot of enemies on our list, these bugs are barely effective fighters. They can usually be taken out by any attack. So what makes them rank higher than some of our previous entrants? Well, as it turns out, it's all about location. Skeeters spend most of their time skating across the water top, which turns out to be a bit of a blind spot in Mario's arsenal. Jumping out of the water onto an enemy is significantly harder to do than when on land. The same applies to using abilities like fire and tail attacks. Additionally, Mario is notably slower at swimming than he is at running, meaning that Skeeters also have an offensive advantage against him. However, they can still be taken care of, if not ignored, pretty easily enough. If he can find them out of the water, they're about as easy to take care of as any other low-level enemy mob. From one arachnid to another, next we have the Scuttlebugs. When these striped spiders are on the ground, they're nothing special. They can be taken out easily and don't do anything to make them more threatening. However, more often than not, they aren't on the ground, but instead hanging from the ceiling and quickly dropping down to attack. They can still be defeated with a single hit. So what places them above the Thwomps, which essentially do the same thing but with more power? Well, a few things actually. For one, the Scuttlebugs have a significantly faster recharge time. This gives them a faster rate of fire and provides the player with a smaller window to counterattack, giving them some form of indirect defense. Second, they don't have the unfortunate downside of taking out their own teammates like the Thwomps do, meaning they aren't actively harmful to the Koopa Troop. Finally, and most ironically, their weaker land-based tactics give them an edge in adaptability, as they are more than mere one-trick spiders. Next, we have another similar enemy, the Swoops. Having a comparable attack strategy to both the Thwomps and Scuttlebugs, Swoops managed to outdo the previous two through their mastery of the ancient arcane art of lateral movement. As ridiculous as it is to say that out loud, simply being able to move to the side while swooping down makes these bats much more erratic than simply moving up and down in a straight line. Additionally, they are generally faster than the Scuttlebugs, making them harder to hit, in addition to being unpredictable. Again, it's another case where any one attack will take them out, but we place them here for how hard it is to actually land that one hit. Speaking of unpredictable attack patterns, our next entry goes to the bloopers. These slippery squids are a staple of underwater levels, and it's not hard to see why. Using this erratic and iconic swimming pattern, they constantly try to swim over Mario and his friends before gently sinking down on their heads. While that may sound relatively harmless on paper, anyone who has been unfortunate enough to be caught in a swarm of them knows that these things are impossible to escape. Additionally, the bloopers are underwater and they can be beaten by any attack. However, actually attacking them is a problem between their immunity to stomps and their ability to dodge fireballs. Now, ironically, what actually hurts their ranking are the blooper variants. Aside from the big bloopers and a couple spin-off variants, they are all less effective than the original due to being less aggressive and not taking advantage of their signature unpredictability. Let's take a break from the classic enemies to cover another newer generation mob, the Scaredy Rats. Okay, we promise these are the last of the cannon fodder enemies on this list. Now, on the surface, these rats are no different than other low-level enemies, only capable of running back and forth before falling to any attack. However, they are significantly faster than other mob enemies, making hitting them while running difficult. They also appear in large numbers, making targeting any specific one of them borderline impossible. What's more, when one of them falls, the rest fly into a panic, making them collectively harder to hit while also harder to avoid, giving them a better chance of counterattacking. For that reason, we had to place these pale pests as the strongest of the cannon fodder mobs. Our next entrant takes us back to Yoshi's Island once again with the Burts. These beautiful, bulbous boys bounce around, hoping to bowl over the bothersome baby buddy breaching their bastion. Alliteration aside, birds tend to work in pairs, bouncing on top of one another to increase their acrobatic assault. On top of that, they're a bit more resilient than most enemies, as they cannot be eaten, and jumping on them only causes Yoshi to bounce off of them harmlessly. They can be defeated with an egg or a ground pound. However, like with our previous entrant, defeating one causes the others to bounce around a lot more aggressively, making them much more dangerous and harder to avoid. This earns the Burts a spot in our lower to mid section of our list. Next up are the Monty Moles. These adorable little pests love to dig a tunnel, dig a tunnel, popping up out of nowhere to catch Mario by surprise. Then they relentlessly pursue him at an alarming rate, making them a lot harder to avoid than most enemies. Additionally, a few variants such as the Mega Moles and Rocky Wrenches are tricky enough to deal with on their own, pushing the average up quite a bit. The thing is, once they lose the element of surprise, they really aren't that threatening. They can be dispatched easily once they've already launched their attacks. This only means we can't rank them any higher. For our next subcon resident on this list, we have the Ninjas in our next spot. While not too threatening in any one appearance, as a whole, they are shown to be one of the most adaptable single-species enemies in the franchise. Camouflage, substitution, transformation, shuriken throwing, duplication, healing, and, of course, their signature running and jumping are just some of their many abilities. While the Ninjas never use more than one or two of these abilities in any one appearance, we feel like this only adds to their ranking. You can never be too sure what these diminutive shinobi will throw at you. Still, once you know their MO, they are pretty easy to deal with, so we can't place them any higher than this. Now we have an enemy that got more and more forgotten as the series went on, those being the Rexes. Having only appeared in 4 games total, only a single one of which being in the main series, the Rexes are one of the more underutilized classic Mario enemies. What they lack in effectiveness or originality, they make up for in resilience. They are resistant to being jumped on, taking several stomps to get finished off. What's more, the more they're stomped on, the smaller and faster they become, making them harder to hit and easier for them to hit you. Unfortunately, their limited appearances, lack of noteworthy variants, and simplistic attack pattern keep them from ranking any higher. Still, we have to give these dinos some credit for being one of the few enemies capable of taking more than a single hit. For a much more utilized enemy from this era, our next slot goes to the Spikes. While they were slower to gain popularity, these tiny turtles have become one of the more recognizable enemies in recent Mario games. They're not themselves spiky, but their signature attack involves them hurling, in both definitions of the word, spiked balls and bars at Mario and friends to attack. This gives them some similarities to the Huckett crabs, but these have a few advantages over their crustaceous cousins. For one thing, they actually move, giving them some added usefulness. More importantly, Spike's balls cannot be safely jumped on. They even have varying sizes and shapes, which gives them a lot of natural versatility over the crabs, and most of our previous entrants. As we approach the midway point of our list, we find the Pokies in the dead center. These cheerful cacti were a bit trickier to place. On one hand, they are taller on average compared to most enemies, making them generally harder to avoid than most enemies. However, that's just about the only consistent factor about them. They can be jumped on sometimes and cannot be touched at all in others. They can sometimes fire their segments as projectiles, and they can sometimes do nothing but wander around slowly from side to side. They have a few variants to their name, yet none of them really add nor detract anything significant to their average. Because of this overall ambiguity, we decided that the direct center of the list was the best spot for these prickly plants. Speaking of prickly, our next entrant has to go to the Spinies. Remember what we said about the spike top being nearly indestructible? Well, the same has to go for the Spikies as well. While they don't share their cousin's fire immunity, in a large enough swarm, that really won't change much, which we will see with another entrant later down on the list. There's also the matter of the spiny egg, which is the form they take when they curl up into a ball. While this doesn't always change anything, in some games this results in them becoming completely immune to damage until they come out of this form. This added defense, plus the spikes that keep them from being jumped on, make the Spinies much stronger than the average foe. Up next are the coolest enemies on this list, those being the Cooligans. These pernicious penguins have a lot in common with the Rexes. They have very few in-game appearances, require multiple stomps to defeat, and change speeds upon the first hit. While Cooligans slow down rather than speed up like the Rexes, they still have the edge over the lizards mainly due to their location. Cooligans appear almost exclusively on ice levels with limited traction, making them harder to deal with than the Rexes who appear on regular plains levels. On top of that, the Cooligans' initial fast speed works better for them. They can potentially come in, strike, and get away before the player can change course enough to counterattack, as the ice makes things difficult. Next, we have another classic enemy with the Bullet Bills. While it would technically be more apt to consider the Bullet Bill blasters in this place instead, the blasters are more often a part of the environment rather than an enemy. On the other hand, the Bullet Bills have always been enemies from the start. Nevertheless, on their own, Bullet Bills are usually fairly easy to deal with. They have very predictable attack patterns, can be defeated by just about any attack, and can even self-destruct in many different games, particularly RPGs. They really shine in their variants, with standouts being Bullseye Bills, Torpedo Teds, and Bonsai Bills. These each have something that makes them noticeably stronger, which really helps their average quite a bit. In keeping with the explosive theme, our next spot goes to the Bob-ombs. By far the most popular resident of Subcon, Bob-ombs have been a staple of the Mario series since their introduction. And it's not hard to see why, since they generally have some of the highest concentrations of firepower among all of Mario's foes. In addition to dealing considerable damage to Mario and his friends, they even have the power to destroy parts of the environment, which few other enemies can boast. There is the unfortunate drawback of the Bob-ombs having to die to use that power, but still it's a sacrifice that Bowser is willing to make for the raw power they offer. From classic staples to a recent addition, we have the Ant Troopers. In addition to climbing up walls, their most notable aspect is their immunity to being jumped on, with Mario and friends bouncing harmlessly off them. They still fall to any other attack, but the ability to resist stomps gives them an edge over the competition. What really pushes them higher is their Big Ant Trooper variant, which has the distinction of being one of the few enemies to be virtually invincible. Not even the Superstar can defeat them. Granted, this ends up being more of a hindrance than a help, since this means they're almost exclusively used as platforms. However, for the sake of having an indestructible member of the species, we have to give these bugs a higher ranking. Now we have one of the most obscure enemies on this list, the Kaboombas. While their name might suggest them to be a variant of the Goombas, like the Octoombas, these are actually more closely related to the Cannons, which are almost as prominent. However, the Cannons are generally environmental elements, while the Kaboombas are actual enemies, so here we are. Anyway, these walking guns share a lot of the resistances we've seen recently, in that they cannot be jumped on, but can be beaten by other means. What pushes these above the other such enemies is that they are, well, cannons. This gives them a projectile attack that keeps them out of the range of danger and more firepower than most enemies in general. Slightly less obscure is our next entrant, the Sumo Brothers, or Sumo Bros. Being very rare enemies appearing in a select few games, they don't have a whole lot of usage to expand their repertoire beyond their base form. However, that's not a problem here, as their base form is quite challenging to deal with on its own. They have spikes on their heads, preventing them from being jumped on, though as they usually stand on platforms high up in the air, that's rarely even an issue to begin with. From there, they can summon fire and lightning to rain down upon Mario, making them quite dangerous to try to get past. This would make them very dangerous foes in general. However, their underutilization and lack of variance leave them just short of the rest of our list. This can be seen by looking at our next entrant, the Magic Koopas. While they can technically be defeated by just about any attack, doing so is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. Not only do they have a projectile attack to allow for spacing between themselves and Mario, but they can also teleport, making them difficult to predict and counterattack. Additionally, they can summon other enemies to attack Mario, something that very few others can boast. This can make these wily wizards a huge problem if left to their own devices for too long. What's more, their appearances in the RPG games make them one of the trickier enemies to deal with, as their magic can take on different properties depending on their variants. With all this to consider, we have to give these magical menaces a higher ranking. It's a similar case with our next entrant, the Hammer Bros. Another staple of the Mario series, these are often considered to be the elite members of the Koopa Troop. And again, it's easy to see why. They throw many hammers in a forward arc, giving them great range in front of and below them. And while they can also be killed by any attack, considering the high rate of hammer fire, doing so is far from the easiest thing in the world. On top of that, they have several variants, each offering something new while being equally difficult to deal with. These are Boomerang Bros, Fire Bros, Ice Bros, Sledge Bros, and the amazing Fly and Hammer Bros, just to name a few. With all this, it's clear these bros have earned their reputation as elite members of Bowser's forces. Earning a significantly higher spot than their cousins, we have the Whomps in our next slot. While they aren't invulnerable like the Thwomps, they have the advantage of mobility on their side, which ends up dealing with a lot of the issues of predictability that doomed their blocky friends. This also means that they can more effectively use their raw power than the Thwomps, meaning that their instant death attacks are much more devastating. However, as we mentioned, they are not invincible, as the glaring weak spot on their backs can easily be exploited to defeat them. This prevents the Whomps from scoring any higher. Next up is an interesting case, that being the Boom Booms. Boom Boom is both the name of the species as well as the specific character that serves as a recurring mini-boss in the games they appear in. Looking at the species as a whole, they are pretty resilient. As a mini-boss, they require several hits to be defeated and have several different attacks under their belts to make dealing with them a pain. Additionally, recent games have included a female variant known as the Pom-Poms, which offers an even wider arsenal of attacks to use. Ultimately, however, they suffered the same issues as the Ninjas. Once their tricks have been revealed, they can be easily maneuvered around and defeated. Still, we give these flailing fiends a solid spot on our higher end of the list for having the chops to be a mini-boss in and of themselves. It's a similar case with our next entrant, the Chargin' Chucks. Like with our previous entrant, these ferocious football players require several hits to be defeated and have a wide arsenal of attacks they can use. This can include rapidly throwing baseballs, kicking footballs, digging rocks, splitting into clones, summoning other enemies, and their signature charge tackles. Indeed, if we were to look exclusively at their debut game, they could easily make it into our top 10. However, in this case, their recent appearances end up hurting their average, as they were made considerably easier to deal with in later games. In addition to requiring fewer hits to defeat them, their arsenal has since been restricted to just their signature charge tackle attack. These factors make them overall much easier to deal with. To keep the theme going, our next spot goes to the Bruisers. Coming in at a whopping 35 places above our last Spectre, these aggressive ghosts are another case of requiring multiple hits to be defeated. They also have multiple attacks of their own to utilize. What places them above our previous entrants is that they utilize their attacks on the environment and the player. This allows them to pursue Mario through unbreakable blocks and use nearby barrels as projectile attacks, giving them a wide array of options at their disposal, earning them a higher spot on our list. From one ghost to another. Next up are the Boos. Another staple of the Mario series, here we have another enemy that is immune to almost any attack. What's more, they take full advantage of this immunity, relentlessly pursuing Mario and Co. independent of obstacles and even solid walls, assuming that they aren't being watched. Actually, it's that signature shyness that keeps them from placing any higher. Mario can simply glance in their general direction to freeze them in their tracks, providing an exploitable weakness that can allow the player to ultimately avoid them. Because of that, we can't place the Boos any higher than this, but ignoring the power they do have would just be asking for trouble. Just outside of our top 10, we have the Ravens. Like most of the list, Ravens can only walk or fly on rare occasions. However, they manage to supplement this with their resistance to attacks, being one of the few residents of Yoshi's Island to have an immunity to being swallowed. They don't even receive damage at all in some cases. Additionally, they can ignore the laws of gravity, spending their time walking around tiny spheres in the sky, making them even harder to deal with. They may not be the most intimidating foe on the island, but the Ravens are certainly not to be thought lightly of either. Our next spot goes to the bespectacled scourge of the skies, the Lakidus. To get the negatives out of the way, they are another enemy that falls to pretty much any attack, and, well, that's about all we can say against these nearsighted nasties. While they can be beaten by any attack, more often than not, they tend to hover well outside of Mario's range. This makes them challenging to deal with in some cases. What's more, their method of attack involves throwing spiny eggs, flooding the field with our 24th ranked enemy. These are in and of themselves challenging to deal with in large swarms such as this. However, if Mario can avoid the spiny swarm and get the Lakitu in range of an attack, they often leave their clouds behind. Mario can then use the cloud to fly over the rest of the stage and get a shortcut to the end of the level in some circumstances. For that reason, while the Lakitus are tricky at best and impossible at worst, we can't rank them any higher than this. Keeping our eyes to the skies, our next slot goes to the Crowbers. As the last of our one-hit wonders on this list, the fact that they've appeared almost exclusively in final levels is pretty impressive, to say the least. Their greatest strengths come from their speed as well as their numbers. Like our previous entrant, they hang out just outside of Mario's range, only swooping down to attack him and his friends. However, the speed at which they attack is so great that it's not only difficult to avoid, but nearly impossible to counterattack. And even if Mario can take care of one, there are always several more where they come from. Crowbers can continuously spawn more and more as the level goes on. While they can technically be beaten by any attack, we feel that these factors make this a temporary solution at best. If left unchecked, the Crowbers can easily stop Mario through their sheer numbers alone, earning themselves a spot near the top of our list. Up next, we have the Urchins. These creatures are covered in spikes, so they're already off to a strong start. In fact, across their various incarnations, they've ranged from resistant to effectively invincible, even when the Urchins can be defeated. Mario usually lacks the resources to be able to do so in these levels. This means the best way to deal with them is to just avoid them altogether, which is possible since they're generally very slow. Still, they are also large and chase after Mario, which makes it challenging to get around them. From one spike ball to another, next up are the Tap Taps. While these red-nosed nasties are smaller than our previous entrant, they make up for that in being almost completely invincible. At best, they can be knocked off a ledge, and at worst, they can be merely momentarily stunned. While they aren't the most threatening enemies on Yoshi's Island on their own, in the wrong place or with the wrong crowd, they can make for a huge problem to deal with. Additionally, there's the matter of the super big Tap Tap variant, which appears in certain sections of levels that seek to destroy the level with Yoshi still on it. This can be difficult to avoid and will almost surely cause death if Yoshi ain't fast enough to get away. Next is another classic enemy with the lava bubbles. This is another case of an enemy being immune to almost all attacks. As the name suggests, lava bubbles reside mainly in lava pools on the edges of the level. It is both a blessing and a curse for these fiery fiends. On the one hand, even if Mario and his friends do have a way of defeating them, they risk falling into the lava and dying anyway. But on the other hand, this can sometimes put them well out of the way of Mario's path, meaning that the lava bubbles would do almost nothing, keeping them from placing any higher. Up next, we have a tie with both the Fuzzies and the Amps just outside the top 3. We're ranking these two together since they basically fulfill the same role. They spend their time circulating around blocks and or across lines hoping to catch Mario and Co. while they try to get past. What puts them this high is the fact that they're basically invincible. While Fuzzies can sometimes be beaten by some very specific methods in certain games, Amps are almost always immune to all attacks. This is why they're some of the most resilient enemies in the Mario universe. Our bronze medal of strength goes to the biggest bugs around, the Wigglers. Ignoring their appearances in the Mario Galaxy games where they're admittedly easy to defeat, these caterpillars tend to range in difficulty from challenging to impossible. Their massive size makes getting around them difficult. Additionally, they're immune to most, if not all, attacks, meaning that they can't be defeated easily. On top of that, if Mario does try to attack them, this only enrages them to the point where they become much faster and more aggressive. And that's only looking at their incarnations as mob enemies. There are many cases where these bipolar bugs serve as boss battles in the games they appear in. The only thing that hurts their ranking is, again, their appearances in the Mario Galaxy games, where they can be easily beaten in just 2 hits. However, even there, dealing with them requires some level of forethought, so we can't count it against them too much. Taking the silver medal is yet another fan favorite, the Chain Chomps. Considering how these metal mutts were born from Shigeru Miyamoto's childhood trauma, it makes sense how they've become one of the strongest enemies in the entire series. Impervious to all attacks in almost every incarnation, the only way to truly deal with them is to avoid them altogether. And considering the speed and unpredictability at which they attack, that can prove to be difficult at times. Even in the RPGs, where enemies are usually made easier to deal with across the board, Chain Chomps are still some of the most resilient foes. Sometimes they are notable for being among the few enemies to remain completely invincible, even there. The only thing holding them back, quite literally in this case, is their eponymous chains. It prevents them from running rampant most of the time and makes them somewhat easier to avoid than they would be otherwise. However, this isn't always the case, as the Chain Chomps do have a few unchained variants, which can be very difficult to deal with, of course, solidly earning these pernicious pooches a spot this high up. The gold medal of strongest enemy in Bowser's forces has to go to the Blargs. Ranging in appearance from a small dragon to a sentient mass of lava, they only have a handful of direct appearances since their introduction. Again, they are mostly invincible in almost every game they've appeared in. At best, they can be temporarily stunned. What really cements their place at the top are their variants. From the aquatic Nepinuts to the colossal Gargantua Blargs to the deadly Magmargs. The only things that have been consistent since their base forms have been their power and their invulnerability. Additionally, it's worth mentioning that every dragon that has appeared throughout the series, except for Odyssey's Ruined Dragon, has had the exact same face as the original Blargs. This implies that they may be related. In particular, the dragons from the Thousand Year Door and Super Paper Mario all have their Japanese names containing the Blarg's name in theirs. This confirms that they at least are the same or related species. Considering all of this, their raw power, their invulnerability, and their massive brethren, we have to recognize the Blargs as the strongest members of Bowser's army. But let us know in the comments section who you think is the most powerful enemy that Bowser's got at his disposal, and tell us what we should cover next. And if you need a one-up, hit that notification bell and binge our Week to Powerful playlist, where we break down who the most powerful characters are in your favorite games. Thanks for watching!